Welcome to On Par with the President. We're joined today by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and LSU graduate Amy Brittain. A proud Shreveport native, she has been a part of the Washington Post investigative team since 2013. Glad to have you here. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, we're going to tee off a couple basic questions to get it going. When did you first become interested in journalism and decide to make that part of your career trajectory?
So I'm one of those annoying people who kind of knew from the time that they were a kid what they wanted to do. And I decided when I was 11 that this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I was lucky enough to go to a middle school in Louisiana that had a newspaper staff. And we were told at the time that we were the only one in the entire state of Louisiana that had a newspaper staff as an elective. And I loved to write. I loved creative writing as a very young child. And I thought, well, this is a great chance to combine my love for writing and also a personality quirk that I had that my parents might have found a little bit annoying, but I was very nosy. I always wanted to know what people were doing, why they were doing it. I wanted to ask questions. And this was a class where I could write and ask people questions. And that was what I needed to do to make a good grade. So it was the perfect skill set for me.
Awesome. So you're from Shreveport, North Louisiana. What led you to LSU?
Growing up, my family is a big LSU family. My mom went there. My grandfather went there. A lot of extended family went there. So I knew that it was definitely kind of on the radar for me. But at the last minute, I was debating between Indiana, where my dad went to college, and LSU. And ultimately, it was the financial decision for my family. And knowing that I could stay in state, go to a public institution, get that financial support, it was ultimately the best decision. And I'm so glad that I made it.
Well, let me ask you, a lot of people wonder about the utility of a degree. What did you learn in your communications classes that you might still use today as an investigative journalist?
Yeah, so the intro media writing class is really kind of a technical class where you're drilling a lot of important skills that you use. You have to memorize the AP style book to learn style differences. I remember I had a professor who was just drilling it in our heads that busing with two S's, which you often see it misspelled, that type of busing means kissing someone. So you do not want to write that whenever you're talking about busing people, right? So it's right. Those types of like drills that still stick in my head with certain grammatical mistakes and things of that nature. But also when it comes to just the curriculum at the Manship School, I learned so much about ethics, about media law, about how to actually do reporting, to fact check stories. The ethics and the media law classes, those have lessons that I use nearly every day in my career. The challenging thing about journalism is that if you ask 20 people how to report a story, you're probably going to get 20 different answers. It's a field where you can make a lot of different decisions at various points in reporting a story. So it's so important to always remember, to not do harm to people, to always do the right thing, to protect yourself, to protect the institution. And those are values that I learned in how to report very difficult stories.
Well, you started here at LSU pretty early being involved with the newspaper, right? You were part of the Reveille Newspaper Reporting Group. How did that impact you as a student and as a reporter?
Oh, it was great. It changed everything for me. Being on campus, first of all, it's a great way to learn about the university. The university is essentially a community. It's a large community. It's larger than some towns in America. So to come in as a freshman and to learn how the university is set up, where the colleges are, who's in charge of the colleges, who's in charge of the veterinary school, to try to reach out to people for comment. Once again, it kind of gave me that blessing to go be nosy, to ask questions, to figure out how things work. And one of my very first stories involved a story concerning the chancellor at the university at the time. Back then, we had a chancellor system, a chancellor in place and assistant president. So it gave me the chance to be asking difficult questions of him, which, I'm sure that as a president, you're probably not fond of student journalists asking you difficult questions. But as a reporter, there's no better training than to get in and to have that type of experience. from the get-go. And then I became a sports reporter, which in some ways was even more difficult because you're asking coaches questions that they don't want to answer. And you're covering the athletic department, which in many ways functions like a professional sporting team. I mean, that is tremendous experience. It's tough. It's grueling. There were stories that left me in tears. There were stories that challenged me, and it made me tough. And I always realized that if I was able to succeed at this job, it was not going to be easy. You know, I didn't pick this career because it was going to be easy. So to have those difficult experiences as a student certainly set me up for success.
That's really great to hear. And we love our student reporters. I give them a hard time every once in a while, and then they kick back at me. I actually like doing that because they are tough, you know, and you're describing how you become tough. That's powerful for me to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I always say student journalists are journalists. You know, there's an amazing student journalist at Stanford University who uncovered fraud related to academic research of their university president out there. I mean, that's some of the best journalism in the country that's been done this year. Just because you're a student doesn't mean that you're not a full professional journalist. And I love to see that. And we need more young journalists in this industry.
Awesome. So where has your career taken you since you earned your LSU degree? What happened? How did it all unfold?
I mean, it's always been journalism for me. You know, I never doubted it. So after I graduated, I went to Columbia for my master's degree. And there I went into a specialized investigative reporting program. Before then, I kind of wanted to be a sports writer who did investigations. But after I did the Columbia program, I uncovered a really powerful story about police officers and firefighters who were abusing anabolic steroids and human growth hormone. And seeing how that was an abuse of the public trust, it kind of took me into a general investigative reporting path. And I kind of put the sports writing dreams aside and followed that path. And then I started at the Star-Ledger in New Jersey, which was the largest paper in the state of New Jersey. And a couple of years after that, I joined the Post. And at the time that I joined the Post, I was the youngest investigative reporter that they had ever hired onto the investigative team.
That's a journey. To talk, because people sometimes think it's just very smooth and linear, you know, life course and careers. What are some of the challenges you face at the start of your career, and how have they evolved to the present time?
Oh man, yeah, I faced a lot of challenges, you know, for better or worse. I can be a little bit hard-headed sometimes, dedicated, stubborn. And as a young reporter, you know, you have to realize that there are certain strengths that you have, certain weaknesses that you have, and you have to rely on your colleagues to produce the strongest story that you can. I mean, one story that I wrote, that steroid story, after I brought it to the Star-Ledger as an investigative project and we were finishing reporting it, there was another veteran reporter who came on to help me report and write the story. And I remember being like a little bit frustrated that in the writing component of it, I was, you know, deferring to a more veteran reporter, but that's what the paper needed. You know, the paper needed, you know, the strongest reporter or writer to help stitch all the reporting together. So you kind of have to learn that there are people who have been in this field who are experts who you can learn from. You know, that's part of the growing pains as a young reporter who thought that I could do everything and excel at everything. You have to learn that stories often don't come together. What we do as investigative reporters, I think we probably have the highest level of failure in our industry. And you have to know when you have enough to publish and when you don't have enough to publish. And when you don't have enough to publish and you have to kill a story, that's a devastating reality, but it's just the reality of the business. You know, I often say that my father is an oil and gas geologist, and growing up, he would have the job of figuring out when to drill. And you have a lot of signs that would be pointing him to a spot where he thought that there would be oil under the ground, right? So all of the metrics are pointing him there. He thinks it's going to be a success. And then sometimes you drill and there's no oil there. And in his industry, that's called a dry hole. In our industry, that's basically a killed story where you start reporting something and you think it's going to be there, and then it doesn't turn out to be what you think it's going to be. And to be a good investigative reporter, you have to be okay with failure, because you never want to put a story in the paper that's not complete, that's not accurate, that's not thorough. So I've learned to kind of live with that reality of not always having the perfect story or not always being able to publish what I want to publish.
That analogy is quite powerful. Thank you for that. So you're part of the Post's first long form investigative podcast. What was the transition like from, doing print journalism to doing the podcast world?
Yeah, so it's been quite a journey for me. I think whenever I used to describe my job, I would say I'm a print reporter, I'm a newspaper investigative reporter. And now I've come to believe that we shouldn't live in one medium. I'm an investigative reporter and I'll tell a story in the best format and the most powerful format that it needs to be in to tell it. And this type of story that I was reporting, it was made for audio. The voices were so powerful. I could have never written that story in an equally powerful way as it existed in a long form narrative audio format. So for me, the biggest thing I learned is just to be quiet and listen. And when I say that, I mean that if you're interviewing someone, we have a tendency, and you probably have a tendency to do it too, if you're talking to someone, to verbally acknowledge what they're saying. And typically you say, yeah, all right. You typically kind of interject to reassure yourself and reassure the person that you're paying attention. And when you listen to that in audio, it's just so grating. It's so terrible to listen to because you just want to say, shut up, let the person speak, let them talk. So I had to learn to be quiet and listen. And I would often nod vigorously. So I would just be shaking my head, yes, acknowledging that I'm listening to them, but not saying anything. And when there is silence, sometimes we jump in because we don't want to let that silence sit there. But I've often found that people will say the most meaningful things if there's a few seconds of silence, and they will often fill that silence with a profound statement. So it's really changed the way that I report and I ask people questions. It's also changed my writing because when you're making a podcast, you realize that any sentence that is a compound sentence or has a long introductory clause, you have to take multiple breaths. And you realize that it's not a good way to make a podcast of constantly having to gasp for breath in the middle of a sentence. So that's normally a sign for me that my sentences are too long and they need to be stripped down for a subject verb, simple format. Take out the clauses, take out the compound sentences. Simple writing is the best writing with active verbs. So it kind of gets back to the basics in that sense.
Do you see how I took a pause?
Are you looking for me to say something profound?
No, I as a professor, I would always encourage my students to write simple sentences with action verbs, stay away from the verb to be. And it's just far more powerful. It's very difficult to get people to do that because you actually have to think harder. And I'm just so glad you said that. So I'm highlighting it just not only for folks in journalism, but just anybody writing anything in general. Short, action, people gravitate to that. That's powerful. Sounds like you're ready to be a professor now.
You say the word, I could come home.
oh boy, here we go. I have to be careful what I say, but you never know.
One day I would love that. There's nothing that I love more than teaching a next generation of journalists. And every time that I've come back to LSU and I've gotten to talk to classes, it's much more rewarding to me, I'm sure, than it is useful to them, because you see that passion, you see that you see someone's eyes light up whenever they get it. And I love that aspect of our industry. So I always try to talk to students whenever I have the chance.
That's awesome. Well, let's talk about the Pulitzer Prize. That's a big deal. Why don't you walk us through how you got to that story and a little bit about how the prize works?
Right. So that project was a massive undertaking by our newsroom, and I was part of a team of reporters who looked at fatal police shootings across the country. And this project was kind of brought into fruition by my colleague, Wes Lowry, who had the idea after the Ferguson shooting of Michael Brown to take a look at how common these types of shootings are. And what Wes realized is that there was no way for journalists to definitively say how many police shootings take place in America every year. And police departments didn't even have to report it up to the FBI. It was voluntary for them to report such shootings. So what Wes and a team of Washington Post reporters and researchers did was set out to track every shooting. And we did that mostly through local media reports, compiling those, verifying the information, going back and setting up a database. And what made that project really unique, I think, is if that project had been done in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think the Washington Post would have collected a full year of data. And then the following year looked at 365 days of shootings and then started to write stories. But this being in the digital age, that database was launched to the public in April, of the year in which it was launched. And we were launching stories as the data was coming in about what that data was showing and revealing. And in many ways, that's a natural organic process because we're not steering the data in any way that we want it to be. We're learning as the public is learning. And I was assigned a story that's kind of a counterintuitive story, is that, the cases of Michael Brown, the cases of unarmed individuals being shot are generally outliers in a year of police shootings in America. The vast majority of these shootings exist with individuals who are armed, who are attacking members of the public or attacking police. We unfortunately know that there are so many guns in America, and that is definitely depicted in the data. So I went to Wisconsin to report a story about a young trooper who was on his first day of the job whenever he encountered a bank robber. The trooper ended up shooting the bank robber, and the bank robber shot and killed the trooper. So it's one of those cases in which a law enforcement officer died at the same time as an individual who was shot and killed by police. And, just being a part of that project, being a part of something that was so significant in the public's understanding of law enforcement shootings, it's a tremendous opportunity. It's also such a heavy lift with the newsroom and, even claiming to be a part of it. I just want to be clear that, I played a minor role. It was such a team effort in putting that project together. And the Washington Post has the ability to do those types of big projects. And that is really the joy and thrill of working at a place like the Post, where you can tackle issues that are so large.
And then the prize came about. Obviously, that must be a secret society of folks who are voting on who wins the prize. Is that how the Pulitzer's awarded?
I've never been a juror, but it's secret leading up to it, but afterwards the names of the jurors are publicized. So you realize, who was on the jury in different categories. And when I went to Columbia, that was a big deal, Pulitzer Week, because all these journalists would come in and you would get a chance to maybe meet some of them. Or hear about kind of the work that they've done. And it is a secretive process, and it's a huge honor. At the same time, in my career, I try not to be focused on outcomes. I was talking to a young reporter who's interning on our team the other day, and we were talking a little bit about impact and what happens after a story is published. And I say, one thing that I always make clear to sources, to people who are participating in a story, is that I cannot predict the future. There are stories that I thought would have a tremendous amount of change. Nothing happened. And there are other stories, that resulted in laws being changed and significant overhaul and reform. So I never try to steer an outcome one way or the other. Our only fidelity is to the truth and uncovering the truth. And, after that, what happens is out of our hands. And, it's a beautiful, intriguing part of this industry, is that you just never know what will connect with the public, what will lead to change. And sometimes it's quite a joy and thrill to see things connect that you maybe didn't think would have an impact, but it can also be disappointing on the other side of things if you think that things will resonate and they don't, or people miss a story for whatever reason. And I had a great professor who taught me once that, this industry is kind of like a marathon race, and you can't get too high or too low. You've got to try to keep like the steady pace through a career if you want to have a long and successful career.
Well, I've found as a professor, there's always an article or story that you tell that you're most proud of, but oftentimes it doesn't resonate the most with people. Do you have one like that?
Oh man, I mean, looking, in our industry and looking at the work that I've done, I'm always drawn to stories that give a reader or a listener a sense of something to think about after they're done reading the story. I really don't like stories that exist in black and white. I like stories that exist kind of in the gray zone of challenging people to think about why they feel a certain way or what they're used to. And I would say it was really the subject of the podcast that I did. It's a story that it's about sexual assault. It's about an extremely difficult case in Washington, D.C. And it's ultimately about the decision that someone makes about whether it's worth coming forward to tell their story or not. And as a reporter who's covered sexual assault and misconduct and harassment, I've often thought about what people go through whenever they're deciding to come forward and speak out about something. And I've always thought that if people could hear that process or understand that process, they wouldn't be so quick to judge someone's motivation. I had a story about the legendary television journalist Charlie Rose being responsible for decades of sexual harassment and misconduct. And I remember my voicemail just kind of being filled with some defenders of him saying, why are these women speaking out now? What do they have to gain? Why are they trying to ruin his career? And I thought, oh, if these people could just hear what these women went through in the process of deciding to put their names in a story like this. I mean, it was just gut-wrenching, kept them up at night. It was a full family decision for many of them. And the beautiful thing about the podcast is that we were able to record some conversations that I had with individuals who were making similar decisions. And I've never had as many people reach out to me to say that they were touched or moved or understood something more than I've had since the podcast came out. I mean, it's been out for 3 years and people are still reaching out to me to convey that. So that to me is probably the story that I'm most proud of.
You've displayed a tremendous passion for journalism, and anybody listening probably gets that you love it, but help us understand what journalism means to you, and what would you tell a prospective journalist? What advice would you give them based upon what it means to you?
Yeah, I mean, journalism means everything to me. I think it's a core part of my identity, and it's not just a job to me. It really is a lifelong passion of uncovering facts and trying to get as close to the truth as possible. And sometimes you don't get there, or sometimes you're missing one piece that you think that you need to get there. And that pursuit is ongoing. And it's what keeps me coming back to work every day. When I was a kid, I loved Nancy Drew mystery novels. That was my big thing, is I would read them and I would watch Nancy kind of put together the pieces of figuring out why something happened. And in many ways, we're trying to put together the pieces to figure out why something happened. That kind of drives us to do what we do. And the people that I work with, the people in our newsroom, the people in our industry who I meet at conferences, they share that passion. And when you see how hard people are working to make sure that information is accurate, to make sure that it reaches public view, to uncover facts that have been buried and hidden and, pushed away for years, it really reaffirms that we have tremendously talented journalists in this country. And we are also blessed to work in a country where we have the protection under the First Amendment to do this type of work. Because you look at our colleagues around the world in countries who do not have that right, and you see what can happen whenever citizens of countries don't have visibility into how their government is functioning and what's being hidden away from them. So that is why I do what I do. And to young journalists who are considering the field, I say, come join us. We have a lot to learn from you. There's an entire initiative at the Washington Post right now to figure out how to get younger readers, connected to our work. And to kind of, rather than trying to bring them to the Washington Post, go to the spaces where they are, go to the forums, go to the platforms where they are, and bring our journalism there. So I would say it's one of the best jobs in the world. Is it tough? Yes. But as I remind myself constantly, I did not choose this job because it was easy. If it's difficult, that's good. It's good to work on something that's difficult. Otherwise, if it's easy, it's not going to be fulfilling. It's not going to be rewarding. I've never worked on an easy story that was rewarding for me.
So what moment confirmed for you made the right decision to be a journalist?
So when I was in grad school, I was working on this difficult story, this investigation about steroids and law enforcement, and I went to knock on someone's door who I believed had very valuable information for this story. And I knocked on her door and I explained who I was and what I was working on. And I asked if she would be willing to talk to me. And she invited me inside her home and sat down and talked with me. And that moment, for someone who's not a journalist, they might be like, well, why is that significant? I mean, for me, it's everything, because it's someone who trusted me in that moment and, believed what I was telling them, that their information was important and could play a piece in exposing some information to the public. And it was such an adrenaline rush to do what we call door knocking, to go to someone and to ask them to help bring this story to light. And that's when I thought, oh man, this is fun. This is really, really fun. This is what I want to do forever.
Well, you mentioned fun. I've got a few fun questions.
Okay.
Favorite memory or experience from your time at LSU?
Oh man, there's so many. I have to say, I'm gonna get in trouble probably if I don't say this, but I met my future husband at LSU. So we met in the quad under a very large oak tree that's near Dotson Fountain, and we met at an honors ceremony when he was a sophomore for biological sciences and I was a freshman for mass comm. And he said, I actually, like, to be clear, I don't really exactly remember this conversation, but he said he said he came up to me and complimented me on a series of stories that I'd done in the Reveille, which was a big scandal at the time about student government leaders buying BlackBerry phones for themselves, using student fees to pay for these very, very expensive phones at the time. So that was a big scandal. It was known as BlackBerry Gate. It was the scandal of the day at the Reveille, and he came up to compliment me on the coverage, and we became friends, and now we're married.
Let me ask you one last question. You were recently inducted into the LSU Alumni Association Hall of Distinction as Young Alumna of the Year. What does that recognition mean to you?
I mean, I was floored when they called to tell me that I was selected. First of all, it's just great that someone is still calling me young. That was really exciting. But in all seriousness, it's beyond anything I ever could have imagined. I went into LSU just wanting to be a good reporter and to figure out how to be a journalist. And I'll never forget the day that I moved out of campus. My senior year, I was getting ready to go to an internship to cover the Padres for MLB.com in San Diego. And my mom came down to help me move out of my apartment. And as we were driving off campus, I said, can we just take one more drive around? So we drove around and there were just tears streaming down my face, going by the journalism school, just thinking about how 4 years passed that quickly and how much my life had changed. And LSU will always be such a special place to me. It's kind of made me who I am. And every time I go back there, you kind of feel, I don't know what you feel, something like a flutter in your heart or something, as corny as that sounds, but it just takes me back to that time in my life where you're young and impressionable, and what I did there changed everything for me. I mean, it opened up so many doors and it helped me be confident and helped me learn how to be the best version of myself that I can be. So for someone to recognize me and to say that, that I've done an okay job so far as an LSU alumna, it's really great. And it's also a lot of responsibility because, I don't want to let them down in the rest of my career. It's a vote of confidence for me as a young person. And I want to make sure, that I keep working just as hard and hopefully do a lot more stories that need to be done and bring a lot more facts to the light that need to be exposed. So that's why I do what I do.
Well, it's a well-deserved honor. During this conversation, 3 words emerged from you that I think are foundational to the university and its purpose. You talked about the pursuit of truth. You talked about the need to display courage. And you also talked about operating with an empathetic perspective. And truth, courage, and empathy are the foundational principles of a university, and most certainly the foundational principles of an outstanding journalist. And so it's just with great pride, if I may have it, that you matriculated here and have gone off to do wonderful things on important topics. And you represent the very best of the scholarly tradition that's unfolded here at LSU over the years. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and excited to learn and read more about your work, and of course the future investigative reporting that you will do will be top of mind for me. So thank you so much.